I realized that under the carpet was a basement in which there was something mysterious. Horror story. I was 8 when I first noticed it, the strange way the house would sometimes breathe. My mother called it the wind, a trick of the old wood groaning in protest against the elements. But I knew better even back then. It wasn't the house itself that made those sounds, it was something inside it, something hidden. The creaks came from beneath the floorboards, beneath my feet, like an exhalation from a forgotten lung deep underground. But I didn't dare ask. My parents were secretive people. My father, tall and stern, worked long hours and returned home late, always looking exhausted but with an odd glint of something in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. My mother, though gentler in demeanor, had the same glint, something furtive, something guarded. They moved through the house like ghosts, careful in their steps and conversations. At dinner, they would exchange glances that I wasn't supposed to notice, little nods, unfinished sentences hanging in the air like cobwebs. And then there was the basement. They never went down there, not that I ever saw. But I heard them sometimes late at night, the subtle creak of the door, the shuffling of feet on the old stairs, the low murmur of voices that never made it above a whisper. I would press my ear against the floorboards from my room above, straining to catch a word, a phrase, but I never could. The basement was always locked and the key, a small tarnished thing, hung from a chain around my father's neck. Whenever I asked about it, he would ruffle my hair and laugh, his eyes too wide, too bright. "You know how old houses are, kiddo," he'd say. "Nothing but drafts and darkness down there. Not worth poking around." But I felt it. The house held its breath whenever I approached the basement door. It waited. The older I got, the more I realized just how carefully my parents controlled the flow of information. Certain questions were avoided, certain topics danced around as if they were landmines buried beneath the surface. The hatch to the basement was never mentioned again after I turned 10, not directly. But once I overheard a conversation in the kitchen. "We can't keep it hidden forever," my mother had whispered, her voice tight with worry. "We have no choice," my father replied. "He's not ready. He'll never be ready." My mother's response was lost in the sound of the faucet running, but her silence afterward said everything. Years passed and the weight of the house's secret grew heavier. Every creak in the night, every subtle groan of the floorboards, sent chills through me. I began to dream about the basement, though I had never seen it. In my nightmares, the hatch would open, and something would slither out, a dark, formless thing that filled the house with whispers and shadows. Sometimes I'd wake in a sweat, the whispers still echoing in my ears, but when I asked my parents about it, they brushed it off. "Just dreams," they'd say. "Nothing more." But I wasn't convinced. On the night of my 16th birthday, my father handed me a gift. A small, simple box, wrapped in faded brown paper, tied with twine. Inside I found the key. The same tarnished key that had hung around his neck for as long as I could remember. My father's face was grave, his expression unreadable. He said nothing as I held the key in my hand, feeling its cold weight. "You're old enough now," he murmured at last, his voice barely more than a rasp. "But be careful. Not all doors should be opened." He left me there, standing in the dim light of the living room, the key pressing into my palm like a brand. My mother was nowhere to be seen. The house, as always, seemed to breathe around me, a slow, deliberate inhalation. I stared at the key for what felt like hours. I had waited years for this moment, years of wondering, of imagining what lay beneath the floorboards. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. I could feel the weight of generations pressing down on me, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath, waiting for me to make my move. That night I couldn't sleep. The key sat on my nightstand, its presence impossible to ignore. The house was quieter than usual, but that only made the silence more unbearable. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and grabbed the key, slipping out of bed with a strange sense of finality. The floorboards creaked beneath my bare feet as I crept down the hallway, past my parents' room, toward the door that had haunted my thoughts for as long as I could remember. The basement door. It was so familiar yet so foreign, a part of the house that had always been there but had never truly been mine, until now. The key slid into the lock easily, as though it had been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a distant drum. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was damp and cool, tinged with the faint scent of mildew and something else, something I couldn't quite place. With the key still in hand, I stepped forward, my bare foot brushing against the top step. And then, from below, I heard it. A sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping like the slow, deliberate beat of a heart. Waiting. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to shut the door, to run. But I couldn't. The house had kept its secret for too long and I had come too far. Without another thought, I began my descent. The stairs groaned beneath my weight as I descended into the dark. With every creak, it felt as though the house was warning me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't stop now. The air was different down here, colder, as if the earth itself was sucking the warmth from my bones. That rhythmic tapping, the heartbeat of the house, grew louder with each step. Slow, steady, alive. When I reached the bottom, I hesitated. The light from the room above barely penetrated the shadows below, casting everything in a dim, sickly glow. My hand gripped the railing as I peered into the abyss, and I realized with a jolt that the basement was far larger than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just a small, cramped storage space beneath the house. This was something else entirely. A corridor stretched out before me. Endless. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture and coated in a thin layer of grime. I could feel the dampness in the air clinging to my skin, sinking into my lungs with every breath. The tapping seemed to come from all around now, echoing down the long, narrow passage. I couldn't see the end. I stepped forward, and the moment my foot hit the floor, the door behind me slammed shut. I jumped, heart racing, spinning around only to find myself enveloped in near total darkness. Panic bubbled up in my throat, but I forced it down. I wasn't a kid anymore. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. It was real, and the only way out was forward. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, using its dim glow to guide my steps. The faint light bounced off the walls, revealing something else: doors. The corridor wasn't empty. There were rooms, dozens of them, lining both sides, all with heavy wooden doors slightly ajar, inviting me to look inside. I stopped in front of the first door. My hand hovered above the doorknob, shaking slightly. The tapping had grown fainter now, almost as if whatever had been making the noise was moving away, deeper into the house's belly. Swallowing my fear, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was small, but it felt vast, the air thick and oppressive. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. There was no furniture, no clutter, nothing that indicated anyone had been in this room for decades. But in the center of the floor lay a doll, an old porcelain doll with cracked, yellowing skin and glassy eyes that seemed to glimmer in the light. Its face was frozen in an expression of terror, its tiny hands reaching out as though it had been trying to claw its way out of the room. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. Why was this here? Why a doll? The unease crawled up my spine like cold fingers. I backed out of the room and moved further down the corridor. Whatever this place was, it didn't feel right. The walls seemed to close in, growing tighter with each step, the darkness pressing in closer. Another door. Another room. I pushed it open, hesitating for just a second before stepping inside. This time the sight was worse. The room was filled with photographs, hundreds of them pinned to the walls, scattered across the floor. I approached the nearest wall and squinted in the faint light of my phone. The photos were old, black and white, but they weren't random. They were of people, family members, neighbors, even strangers. Faces I recognized but couldn't place. My pulse quickened as I scanned them, and then my stomach dropped. One of the faces was mine. A younger version of me, no older than 5 or 6, playing in the yard outside the house. I had no memory of anyone taking this picture. I hadn't even known it existed. Yet here it was, tucked away in the basement, alongside countless others. A sick feeling churned in my gut. I backed away, my eyes darting over the photos, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sense here. Only madness. I stumbled out of the room, the tapping in my ears growing louder again, faster now. Was it following me? I moved down the corridor more quickly, past door after door, each one containing something more disturbing than the last. A pile of bones arranged in a circle, a tattered, blood-stained coat hanging from the ceiling, a mirror reflecting nothing but darkness. It was as though the house had collected all the nightmares it could find and stuffed them into these rooms, hiding them away from the world above. And yet, something kept pulling me forward. It wasn't curiosity anymore. This was compulsion. As if the house wanted me to see. Finally, I reached the last door. This one was different. It was heavier, the wood older, warped and cracked. My heart pounded in my ears as I reached for the handle, the rhythmic tapping now so fast it sounded like frantic drumming. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The room beyond was cavernous, far larger than it should have been. The walls were lined with old, crumbling stones, and the ceiling disappeared into shadows too thick for my phone's light to penetrate. But in the center of the room stood something that made my blood run cold. A cross. It was massive, carved from dark wood, standing tall and ominous, bathed in a faint, unnatural glow that seemed to have no source. The air around it was thick, almost suffocating, and as I stepped closer, I felt a pressure building in my chest, like I was being crushed from all sides. The cross loomed over me, casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch out and engulf the room. I could feel something here, something ancient and powerful. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My feet moved forward on their own, pulling me closer, closer. And then it hit me. All at once, memories came flooding back, crashing into my mind like a tidal wave. Fragments of conversations, whispered arguments, my mother's worried face, my father's stern warnings. The years of silence, the secrets they had kept from me. The way they had always kept me away from the basement, from the truth. The truth they had known all along. They had protected me from this, from whatever was buried beneath the house. But now it was too late. I had seen too much. The tapping stopped. A sudden sharp pain shot through my skull, and the world around me tilted. The room spun, the cross blurring in and out of focus. My vision swam with flashes of light, images of the doll, the photographs, the cross, everything that had led me to this moment. I stumbled, reaching out for something, anything to steady myself, but the floor seemed to drop away beneath me. My vision went dark, the pressure in my head building to an unbearable level. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was gone, the world was gone. And then nothing. I collapsed to the ground, the darkness swallowing me whole. I didn't get back up.